Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Michael Watts, who is the Chancellor's Professor of Geography and Development Studies at UC Berkeley. He's also Director of its Institute of International Studies. Professor Watts, a geographer, is the author of numerous books, including Silent Violence, published by the University of California Press. Michael, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised, Harry, in the southwest of England. I was going to say a small village between Bristol and Bath. It wasn't even a village. It was really a hamlet. It was sort of 4 or 5 clustered houses that were located on the edge of an old commons, medieval commons, an area that was grazed by cattle and so on. And so it was a very small rural community.
And how, in retrospect, do you think your parents shaped your character?
How did they shape my character? In quite different ways, certainly. My father was, I suppose, part of that great English tinkering tradition. Where we lived, we had a very large garden. In fact, we were almost sort of homesteaders, I suppose you'd say. We grew a great deal of the food that we actually consumed. It was sort of organic before organic, if you see what I mean. And so my father was a big gardener, a big outdoors, sort of hands-on sort of person. So in that sense, he bequeathed an interest to me in sort of things natural and outdoors sorts of activities in particular.
And he also introduced you to photography, right?
He did. He was a terrific photographer. I don't know how he got interested in photography. I think it was during the Second World War when he was served in the Navy in the Pacific. But from my earliest recollections, he was a very good photographer. He won a number of. He was an amateur. He tried to make it as a professional and didn't. But he won a number of actually national competitions. And so he instilled in me a very great interest in photography. And actually I first remember him giving me a camera when I was about 5 or 6. And certainly from the time I was 8 or 9, I was working with him in the darkroom in our cottage. And he in fact put a hide, in the top of the garden where I would take photographs of birds and so on. So really from the time I was 9, 10, I was, a sort of a serious child photographer. Not terribly good, but I was very interested in it.
And your mother, how did she influence you, do you think, in retrospect?
Well, both of my parents were part of that sort of interwar generation, Harry. Neither of them really finished high school. My father entered in the war, as I mentioned. My mother likewise didn't finish high school. I mention that because it was a generation in British society that sort of missed out on those opportunities. And I always felt with my mother that she didn't have that opportunity to go on to college and so on. And so it was raised a family throughout her working life. She worked a little bit in the Second World War as part of the war effort. But because we lived this sort of, I said it was sort of a hamlet, village, rural existence. I should also say that it was, when my parents moved into the house that we occupied, I mean, there was no running water, there was no electricity, there was a toilet at the top of the garden. I mean, this was, frankly, a pretty hard rural life. I vividly remember, my mother having to sort of walk, 50 meters to get to the well and lift buckets of water to be brought. So when I say that she was, raised the family, she was really running a small sort of homestead in a sense, and making jams and canning vegetables and so on. So in that sense, I suppose she was again instilled in me a certain interest in things agricultural, rural, sort of the home, a certain type of homesteading life, I suppose.
It's interesting because this relation to nature is a very important theme in your work, which we will talk about in a few minutes. And I'm just curious, looking back, how do you think this background and this environment, commons, right out the door, shaped your choices as a scholar and a person very interested in social causes?
I've thought a little bit about that. I guess one thinks about these questions as one gets older, you know. And I mean, obviously, one of the things that I've done in my professional life is to work on issues relating to agriculture and to rural livelihoods. And indeed, what I've just described was exactly such a, you know, such a rural livelihood. But more than that, and I only came to this relatively lately, was, as I mentioned, this community that I was part of was located right on a commons land, a medieval commons, which is to say that individuals, you know, the commoners had rights to that land. And I obviously took that for granted as a kid. You know, you played soccer and you'd hike on it and you'd catch butterflies and go birding and so on. But I guess I've come to realize also that that's in a curious way also showed up in my own work, you know, that one of the things I've been interested in is exactly how such common lands in Africa, where I've worked, for example, become privatized. And I can now see, you know, that in my childhood, this commons land, which is a beautiful area, where I lived, was also subject to pressures. It was, you know, also being privatized. There were always incursions by some developer to do this and to do that. And there were always struggles around it, keeping its integrity. So that was another sort of aspect of my sort of rural childhood. And I think also in some way, because it was sort of rural, and it was, I mean, in a sense, it was a type of childhood that was really wonderful, that you probably couldn't replicate anymore. You know, we never locked our house. It was always open, even when we went away for long periods of time. And it was a wonderful childhood in all sorts of ways. But it was also sort of rural and in its own way sort of, I was going to quote Marx on, you know, sort of village idiocy, but, you know, there was something cloistered about it too as one gets older that one came to realize. And the reason why I just raised that is that perhaps it had some curious impact on the fact that for much of my life I've traveled a lot. And in fact, I began to travel actually quite early. I was an avid train spotter. There was a big rail line that went through the village. And there was something that I was always attracted to about that it was going somewhere else. And I became a sort of an avid train spotter in my youth. And I, from a young age, I mean, it's unthinkable now actually that, you know, parents would, you know, buy their 9 or 10-year-old a rail ticket and say, well, see you, you know, in 7 hours. And I travel around England collecting, you know, engine numbers and being enamored by steam engines. So I got very much so that background then somehow cultivated in me an interest in travel and moving. And I've always felt that for a long part of my life I was, again, I guess as I began early, I sort of was very interested in other places. And a part of it was perhaps the closure of a rural community, sort of pushing one out a little bit.
Another element that emerges in an essay of yours that you gave me the opportunity to read is the extent to which your relation to nature and the local, which you've just said as a platform to travel, also is bound up with your maturation, your growing, your memories, so that so many of your experiences as a youth were wrapped up with that commons area and hence with nature.
That's right. I was always very interested in natural history, and again, probably in part precipitated by photography, ornithology in particular, and so on. But some of these sorts of interests that I had and this rural lifestyle, so to say, sort of showed up in my own intellectual development much later. And I had previously mentioned this whole question of the commons and living on the commons and being part of a long tradition in Britain anyway of common lands and having access to them and defending and struggling against incursions against them. It was when I really was in grammar school. Actually, when I was 16, I remember 16, 17, I remember this quite vividly. I was first introduced through a very wonderful history teacher of mine, the work of Edward Thompson, and I read his magnificent book called The Making of the English Working Classes. And a part of that book is exactly about commoners and the loss of common rights and so on. And suddenly there was a connection for me between academic and intellectual pursuits and politics, and something that I'd lived and sort of almost taken for granted and not fully understood. And so it was really from that moment onward that I became and subsequently became very interested in that whole group of British left Marxist historians, of which Edward Thompson was one, Christopher Hill was another, Eric Hobsbawm, who were concerned with these sort of deeply English issues about, the commons, about classes, poverty, and so on. And again, so if there was just a connection for me that emerged a bit later that somehow spoke to things that I guess I'd sort of taken for granted living in this particular rural community.
So in a way, you're when you go on and get educated formally in college and then come to the United States to get your PhD at the University of Michigan, I believe,
correct.
right?
That's correct.
That in a way, it's a journey of putting the pieces together. Really, is that a fair assessment? And that the piece I hear the theory bringing is very importantly the sense of class relations, of how existing institution groups and peoples are affected by change and who controls that change.
That's exactly right. And of course, it's easy to sort of read a logic into that, into all of our lives when we look back retrospectively. Right. I don't think that in some sense I either calculated or in some way followed a path, explicitly put those pieces together. But I can now see the traces and the connections from that sort of early exposure to those sorts of ideas. I mean, they I suppose, particularly, again, if I could just come back to, I was really sort of part of that post-war British generation. And obviously Britain has changed a great deal in the last 20 years or so. But at that point, it was hard not to be aware of class. I remember vividly, very, very vividly, this was back when one was 10 or 11 years old, one took a national examination in Britain that basically determined your class trajectory. If you passed this national exam, it's called the 11+, you went to a grammar school. If you did so-so, you went to a technical school. If you failed it, you went to a secondary modern school and became a plumber. Now, through luck more than anything else, I managed to get into a grammar school. And I remember vividly, when I went to that grammar school, very prestigious sort of grammar school, it saw itself as a type of English public school, More than anything else, when I arrived there, it was the fact that people didn't speak like I spoke. They didn't have my accent, my intonation. And of course, that's very much about class. So it was hard for that generation to live in Britain and to go through one's life and have schooling and so on without being hypersensitive to class. Now, most people, when you're young, you don't know what that means exactly. At least I didn't. And so when you ask me the question about Edward Thompson and about the commons and so on, it's when some of these things begin to make sense as a teenager. You begin to be aware of what class you come from in some more explicit way, and what that means, and how it's part of English or British history, and so on.
And what was important about your undergraduate education, what we call undergraduate education? Did it push you in this direction of doing geography?
It did. As you know, in Britain, there's a degree of specialization in high school, which one doesn't really have here. So when I was at high school, I actually finished high school a year early when I was 17. But the principle still held, which was that we concentrated on 3 subjects. And in my case, it was economics, history, and geography. And then one chooses one of those immediately from the time that you go to college. So I went up to college when I was 18 and went to University College London, one of the colleges there, and read geography. And so that's all that really one did for 3 years. So in some sense, it's a very specialized intellectual concern. Of course, it has its costs because unlike a Berkeley education, you don't get to dabble in political science, in music theory, and so on and so forth. So it's very specialized at one level, and so one knows a great deal about these things when one emerges with your undergraduate degree. But perhaps more than anything else, and again, this is a generational thing, of course, I went up to London in the late 60s and was a part of that late 60s generation and became involved in student politics and so on. And so a part of these interests that you referred to before, about the commons and class and all of these sorts of issues, I certainly explored them in geography, and especially with an interest in environmental issues and economic issues in the third world, Africa and Asia in particular. But also outside of the university, and being, of course, in London, a big metropolitan city like that, at that moment when so much was going on in student and especially New Left politics, and of course the Vietnam War in particular. This was, again, I think for many people of my generation, it was as foundational a moment for us as for American kids.
Well, let's talk about that in one second, but I want to ask you one other thing, because there's one other piece that I see in your intellectual journey, and that is the focus on the global. And in fact, in a review I read that you wrote about E.P. Thompson, you point out in one place that his work was focused national on the British story. I'm curious, what was decisive in making your perspective so global?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, a part of it is a generational issue. I think that it's at these formative moments in our history which we can't determine what shows up, as it were, on the global screen or on this political screen at that point. Were in the 60s global events. It was the fact that the US was involved in, frankly, an imperialist war in Southeast Asia. That, in other words, it could only be seen global. It was the fact that those student movements in the 60s were global movements. Mm-hmm. It was Rio, it was Prague, it was Paris, it was London, it was Tokyo. So one felt part of, at least I felt part, I think many people did, of some type of global insurrection or movement, for better or for worse. Mm-hmm. So that had to do with the particular history of that moment, I think. And also, for me, it was just partly, I got that from geography. Again, it was a very charismatic teacher of mine in grammar school who got me interested in other parts of the world, in other cultures and so on. And again, my interest in travel was such that again, from an early age, I began to travel to Europe and abroad and so on. When I was 18, I went to North Africa. 19, I was in Burma, South India. So a combination of those things, I think, a geographic type of interest with a particular political and generational moment. It was sort of hard to avoid the global part of it.
The 60s were such a defining period for so many of your generation, our generation, I should say. I'm curious, and you mentioned one of the points that the events were global. But how else did the 60s and especially that year 1968 affect you, and what were the important lessons there?
I think they're very difficult to digest, Harry, to be honest with you. And I've written a couple of things recently about this issue, focusing on more broadly the question of the legacy of 68 and the 60s, because I think the question is just very difficult, I think it was Henry Kissinger who asked a Chinese delegate once about the legacy of the French Revolution, and the response was, it's still in process. And I think that's the case for the 60s. I think that, obviously there's the whole question of just what broadly gets construed as lifestyle sorts of issues, in which questions of sexuality, sexual mores, various types of consumption issues get completely refigured in the 60s. And obviously we all lived through that, and that has a fantastic legacy in and of itself. I was much more concerned with the political legacy, because from the vantage point of now, there's, in my view, an effort to discredit much of that it was sort of hopelessly idealistic. It was sort of ultimately narcissistic and self-indulgent.
This is what the critics are saying.
The critics are saying. And I think, interestingly, as you perhaps might imagine, that comes from the like of Gertrude Himmelfarb on the political right. But there's a sense of that also in someone like Todd Gitlin's brilliant and wonderful memoir on the 60s, that it was sort of an unfortunate deviation and self-indulgent and so on. All of which, it seems to me, if one lived through it, one would have to recognize as being obviously in part true. But I do think that there's also other legacies from that, which need to be reclaimed, and I think they are political. I don't think you can understand much about the current concern with civic organizations, the way in which civil society is now getting invoked outside of the spheres of government as a new realm of governance, without recognizing that many of the people who became disenchanted with the 60s sort of went, as it were, underground, or went or embarked upon that long march, as it's been called, through the sort of institutions in the 70s and 80s, in neighborhood movements, in the green movement, in the women's movement.
And in fact, forming new movements and new organizations.
Precisely, precisely. And I think that those begin to show up in all manner of complicated ways in the present. And they can't be so neatly and easily dismissed as just being a sort of diversion, an indulgent exercise.
And also there was a quality which you talk about in one of your essays of a kind of an anti-authoritarian, a sense of freedom, of taking matters into one's own hand, not necessarily in the streets, but in terms of starting new organizations, starting movements, and so on.
Precisely. I mean, I think that whether we're talking about the 60s movements in the former Eastern Europe or in the sort of North Atlantic economies, they both had a sort of great skepticism towards sort of mass politics, to the organized state, and saw in some sense the issue as being control of one's life. Now that can be very populist, of course, but that issue of not having control over one's life in some way, and the need to take control through sorts of various non-state or non-authoritarian organizations, movements, and so on. I mean, obviously has a Janus-faced quality to it. It can go in all sorts of directions. The 60s gave birth to SDS and the New Left. It also gave birth to the New Right. So there's nothing intrinsically political about it, no particular trajectory. But it unleashed a whole set of energies, I think, that then get built upon and are, in a sense, it's hard to imagine the current political landscape without them.
You quote Sartre in this essay on progress in geography, and you talk about his identifying the stretching of the boundaries of the possible. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's exactly what it was about, and surely there's no realm in which that possible was stretched that is perhaps more dramatic than the fact that we're sitting on the Berkeley campus. And the 60s surely was as much about pulling and pushing this institution called the university and the academy and opening it up in all sorts of ways. Now, of course, on this campus there are many different opinions among people who were here in the 60s about the legacy of that pushing and pulling, but it surely made it a more democratic and open and free environment. And it's hard to imagine the types of academic programs that we have now, for example, and the types of flexibilities that students have without realizing that that was itself a part of a legacy of the 1960s.
Now, let's talk a little about geography, and we know that you have focused on development as one of your main interests, but help us understand better, especially for an American audience, what does a geographer do?
Well, that's a question that geographers often get asked, in this neck of the woods. And I suppose I'd start from the following observation, which is that the fact that you're asking that question, and it gets asked so frequently here, says a great deal about the fact that geography is not institutionalized as an academic discipline in the United States in the same way that it is in other parts of the world. So, for example, in Europe, one is taught geography from the age of 5, and that geography is a part of the national curriculum. And in academic settings, in universities in Britain, let's say, geography departments have the size and the stature of history. Most geography departments are larger than most sociology and anthropology and history departments in British universities. So I would start off from and this is true in France, in Germany. So I would start off from the fact then that it's institutionalized there in a much more dramatic way. Many departments, many universities don't have departments of geography in this country. Now, it is perhaps true that many people think of geography, the sort of geography gets taught in primary school and secondary school in Europe, as being about places and maps and what's the capital of Iowa and so on. Now, that is in fact partly true, although I would say in response to that, Harry, that that's not something that is unimportant in and of itself. I, as you know, enjoy teaching large undergraduate classes, and I used to give a quiz at the beginning of my large undergraduate geographical quiz. Just I'd hand out a world map and say, locate, Rio, and locate Burma. And, you know, after, 5 years of seeing Brazil located just outside Brownsville, Texas, I began to get very depressed, and I stopped doing it. And there's something about then this just basic geographical, cartographical ignorance in this country, which in and of itself endorses, I think, geography. But the point is, of course, geography as an academic and research discipline is not just about those sorts of things. But the point is that it's very weakly institutionalized here. Now, we could talk a little bit about why that is the case. I think in Europe, it's not unrelated to colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, the origins of the discipline go back to exploration and go back to the colonial project. Geography is inseparable from both of those things. It's not a particularly pleasant history. But the mere fact that Britain, France, Belgium had an empire, that it was very concerned that citizens know about it, and so that geography was then an imperial discipline. And so that's perhaps part of it. But I think it also became just an important part of the curriculum because of what it did intellectually. And I think that raises, a whole series of other concerns here about what geography has become. And it's more obviously than cartography, although that's still very important. It's, although cartography now is increasingly, with the use of computers and so on, become, or it's called, geographic information systems. It's a very sophisticated way of displaying economic and social data cartographically. That's an important part of the discipline. But another part of it, of course, is what we'd probably call environmental studies. I mean, geography was always about, in some way, the relationships between nature and society. And so, it's in my view, unfortunate that from the 60s onward, when we had this huge environmental studies boom here, growing out of the environmental movement, geography didn't capture that, and geography wasn't here to capture it. And so, hence, we have all sorts of environmental studies programs around the United States, which, in my view, do geography. The relationships between human practices and environmental consequences. Soil erosion in Africa, global climate change and its consequences, and so on and so forth. So that's another part of the discipline which, as I say, unfortunately, was an opportunity that I believe was missed here. That doesn't really explain, it seems to me, fully the question of why geography isn't at Harvard or Stanford. It was, incidentally, and both of those departments, and this is a big part of the story, I think, they were closed in the 1950s, and of course that can have the effect of delegitimating the discipline. David Landis, who's a Harvard historian, just wrote a book recently on the wealth and poverty of nations, a sort of grandiose view of economic development, in which geography figures very, very centrally. And he makes the point in that book that what a terrible tragedy it was when those departments were closed, and how geography then sort of disappears from many universities and from the academic curriculum. And so he's been one of our big boosters, and in fact a number of people have sort of latched on to geography recently. Jeffrey Sachs has been writing about the role of geography in economic development. Paul Krugman, the economist, writes about it. So it's there. It's just, I believe that because geography was so weakly institutionalized here, it gets taken up, unfortunately for us, in other disciplines.
You wrote in one of your essays that you speak of the sensitivity of a geographer to territory, location, and to issues of confinement and exclusion. And as one reads your work, what I would characterize it as a social scientist, finding very interesting problems to look at in a world that is undergoing great changes because of what we're now calling globalization.
Absolutely.
And so let's talk a little about what globalization is and how you as a geographer look at it. And I guess the first question is, it's not really a new phenomena, is it? I mean, or what is new about its present manifestation?
About globalization?
Yeah.
Well, before I say a few words about that, perhaps let me just go back and relate that to your question about geography as a discipline.
Yeah.
Because I said, well, there is a cartographic side to the discipline. I said there's an environmental studies side to the discipline. There's also, and this is your question, there's a concern with space. If in some sense history departments are concerned obviously with changes over time, then in some sense geography, you might say, a concern with space and its role in society is another part of its intellectual mandate. And I say that because geography as a discipline is one of those curious disciplines that embodies, like anthropology, the physical-biological earth sciences with social science. And so in some sense, it always has intellectual tensions within it. And space is obviously a part of that. Now, space obviously has many sorts of manifestations. One of them is cartographic, how you transform one space into another, a territory into a map. But we're also concerned, obviously, with different types of spaces, urban, regional, local, community, or with territories and how certain territories take on certain sorts of meanings, nations, nation-states. So we have a long-standing commitment then with space in its various iterations. In that sense, then, to come back to your question, globalization is simply one way of thinking about space. And more properly, you might say, it's one way in which you could say the friction of space is increasingly overcome. Right? Obviously, there are costs involved in moving from one place to another. Different spaces have different ecological, physical, social characteristics. But what we can say is there's a friction to space. And of course, technology and various types of technical revolutions have an ability to overcome that friction. That's as true for the bicycle as true for the rail system. And there's a wonderful cartoon published in the middle of the 19th century about the impact of the British rail system, about exactly, sort of bringing Britain, as the cartoon implied, into your living room, sort of overcoming space. Well, globalization, you might then say, perhaps driven by, the informatics revolution, is one further iteration of this overcoming of the friction of space. And you say, well, is it particularly new? Well, as I was suggesting, no, there was a profound period of globalization at the end of the 19th century. That was also driven by technological sorts of questions. It also had political manifestations, imperialism, colonialism. So we could perhaps see different epochs of globalization, perhaps the 15th century and the commercial, mercantile expansion from Spain, Portugal, the opening up of the New World and so on. One might argue that that's another period of globalization. So they always have different types of characteristics driven by communications, technology, driven by the intensivity of connections. Obviously, globalization implies, through the overcoming of the friction of space, connectivity. And so obviously if you read Manuel Castell's work, for example, on the network society, this is a wonderful example. It's just exactly how new forms of connectivity are overcoming the friction of space. So that gives our conjuncture its particular specificity. I think geographers have been, writing about this for some time, and perhaps haven't gotten the dues that they deserve in thinking about globalization. And I think one of the ways that they've done it rather differently is to emphasize that, in fact, globalization in our current epoch should not imply either a totally frictionless world. That's nonsense. Nor should it imply that all of the world is sort of somehow encompassed in this new network society. The villages that I reside in northern Nigeria, in some respects, are incredibly marginal to this thing called globalization. They're what Manuel Castells calls black holes. And so he tries to emphasize that at the moment of global inclusion, you have simultaneously global exclusion and marginalization. So geographers have emphasized then this idea of not of a frictionless world, of not of complete inclusion, and thirdly of globalization not somehow eradicating or homogenizing the local. So there's in geography a great concern with the global and the local, and how increasing globalization, in the way that I've described it, can actually produce, paradoxically, new forms of local attachment or new forms of localism. Indeed, you might argue that much of what we've seen in the Balkans is a particular type of localism, of an attachment to local or ethnic or other types of identification that are, in a sense, stand at a contrast or at a counterpoint to the very idea of cosmopolitanism or a global citizenship.
And this nexus of the local and the global is a place to really find insight into a lot of interesting things that are going on in today's world, especially the extent to which we have tremendous new wealth, but alongside increasing poverty among the people at the bottom of the rank. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, this speaks to this question of just to invoke Manuel Castell's work, this black hole, the exclusion. And we know if you read, for example, these rather bland statistics that appear every year, published by the United Nations Development Program or by the World Bank, they're all, whatever your politics, they're pretty incontestable, which is that however you measure global income, assets, household income, national income, however you measure it, there has been, let's say since 1960, an increasingly dramatic polarization. It's absolutely extraordinary. So at the same moment we have the rise of the Bill Gateses of the world, 200 people who can account for a very substantial proportion, 30% plus of global wealth. You also have vast numbers of people that are excluded. And of course, as you mentioned before, I've spent most of my life, professional life, working in Africa. And Africa, in a sense, is precisely bearing the burden of that exclusion. It's been estimated that the average standard of living of an average sub-Saharan African, if there were such a thing, is lower now than it was at political independence.
A lot of your research has been in Nigeria, and that would be a good case to talk about, because it has gotten through the last few decades by exploiting its oil resources, but in the end, really not creating a unified Nigeria. Talk a little about that and the extent to which resistance to the decay in Nigeria and the exploitation, it takes the form of local resistance groups.
Well, the Nigerian case is an interesting one because it shows something both about the globalization story that we were just talking about. It shows something about the costs, the exclusion that I was referring to. And it also, of course, speaks to the question of resistance, because at the same time we've been talking about this globalization, we've just seen in Genoa, the G8 we're meeting, we have these rise of these rather extraordinary anti-globalization movements. And they have their own parallels and affinities in Nigeria. And Nigeria then is a relevant case because Nigeria was a former British colony, obviously, and it became independent in 1960. Since about 68, 69, the backbone of that economy has been petroleum. Petroleum was discovered in 58. It came online commercially in the mid-1960s. Now here is the most global of commodities. It's the very basis of our sort of carbon-based society, industrial capitalism. We couldn't live without it. Probably Nigeria is the 7th largest exporter of oil. It's probably produced, in its producing lifetime, $600 billion worth. $600 billion. It's the most global of commodities. Of course, it's produced by and dominated by the most global of organizations, the transnational oil companies. They don't produce alone, they produce in joint ventures with the Nigerian state. So here's a great globalization story, in a sense. Of course, after having said that, it's quite clear that Nigeria is still, after 40 years of pumping, a low-income country. And indeed, in some respects, I would argue, it's perhaps materially and economically worse off now than it's ever been. And indeed, the heart of the oil-producing regions, the Niger Delta, the eastern part of the country, is, without question, the poorest, most marginalized part of the country. So here's a classic case of a global commodity, enormous wealth, produced jointly by the Nigerian state and oil companies, that has excluded, not Nigeria as a whole, but particularly the oil-producing countries, the oil-producing regions. Now, of course, one has to explain that, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that you can lay Nigerian poverty and this squandered wealth, $600 billion worth, at the hands of Shell or Chevron. I think they have their role to play. I think they've done almost nothing in some fundamental respects with regard to Nigerian development. One has to look, in my view, at the Nigerian state with the Nigerian leadership, and I think its inability to use those oil monies in a productive way, as opposed to using it in highly corrupt, highly politicized ways to essentially, to come back to the question that you posed, to purchase a type of political consent to keep Nigeria together. Nigeria is a complicated, multi-ethnic country. It had a civil war in the late 1960s, which was about those ethnic differences. The Nigerian state, awash in all of this money, particularly in the 1970s, used it essentially, in my view, highly corrupt ways, to purchase political consent among these ethnic minorities, or ethnic majorities, to keep the country together. It's kept a lid on it. The cost of that, of course, is that much of this money has been squandered, evacuated out of the country, used for all manner of illicit purposes, and not for productive purposes. Which, of course, then raises, as you can imagine, this question of resistance, which you ended with, which, of course, Nigeria then becomes, after 30 years of corruption, military rule, squandering of enormous oil wealth, in which the average citizen hasn't benefited, and the oil-producing areas have benefited least. Suddenly this produces growing resentment. I think you could see it in by the 1970s. It took the form of Islamic movements. You can begin to see it in the last 10 or 15 years in the oil-producing communities, where oil-producing communities now begin to mobilize around their own ethnic identity, claiming the oil for themselves. So these resistance movements take on both an anti-global form. We hate Chevron. We want Chevron to compensate us for the damage it's done, which is substantial, but also anti-state. We want a greater voice in the Nigerian Federation. We want control over our oil. So here, in some sense, the local and the global then come together. It would be crazy, in my view, to point a finger at global forces alone and to simply say that explains the terrible crisis and the poverty that Nigeria confronts. It's an important part of the story. But it's precisely the global and the local, if you like, global forces articulating with local forces that one has to understand, I think, to begin to detail this crisis that Nigeria currently
You quote Edward Said as saying violence, referring to violence as struggles over geography, where these struggles involve not only guns and bullets, but also symbols, imagining, and meanings. And this is what we see in movements, for example, like among the Ogoni people,
Precisely.
who were the victims of exploitation because of what was done to their land to get out the oil.
Precisely. The type of territory that Edward Said is referring to here is, of course, on the one hand, that territory called Nigeria. Well, one of the great post-independence leaders, Awolowo, once said that Nigeria didn't exist, he said. He said it was a geographical fiction, a mere geographical expression. It was constructed by the colonial powers. It was multi-ethnic. There was no strong embedded sense of Nigerian nationalism and a series of institutions that helped to create or reproduce that. So that's the territory. And what I've tried to argue in my work is that the peculiar presence of oil, this black gold, this extraordinary resource, actually had the effect of undermining further that sense of Nigerian nationalism. If those oil monies are not building national institutions, but buying off ethnic groups, what you're doing is fragmenting the polity. And so you mentioned the case of the Ogoni movement. That's another type of territory where an ethnic minority, 500,000 people who happen to be sitting on a lot of this black gold, who've seen nothing of its benefits, suddenly get up and say, under a charismatic leader like Sarawiwa, beginning in the late 80s, wait a second, this is our territory, Ogoni land. That oil is under it's Ogoni oil. We want, to use the current lingo, resource control. And so a local territoriality then is being built up here around an ethnic identification, which stands in direct counterpoint to something called Nigeria. What minimally, it seems to me, some of these movements are saying is we want to rethink the whole idea of the Nigerian Federation and what Nigeria means to us. There are some people who begin to see these movements as saying something a little more than that. They're actually going back to the Civil War in the 60s and perhaps saying We want, again to use the lingo, autonomy and self-determination. And in some circles, especially the Nigerian state, that of course rings the bell of secession. So you can begin to see why these essentially local movements are autonomy, self-determination, control of our oil, when oil is the only show in town, and in the context of a history of internal civil strife, this represents a terrific challenge to the powers that be.
I'm reminded of what you first read when you were 16, E.P. Thompson, namely exploring the conditions and the reactions of the people in the locality as the market appeared.
That's exactly right. I mean, perhaps more than anything else, Thompson was concerned with class, with commoners, the working classes, and with their experience of class, not just with what they may or may not do, but not with what particular class map they fit into, but how they experienced being an artisan, being a peasant, being a landless worker. And one of the things that I've tried to do, and I suppose to emulate his extraordinary work, is to begin to look at those classes in Nigeria among whom I work, peasants in the north or Agoni in the south, and begin to see how, in this case, the process of what I've called a petro-capitalism, how these changes unleashed by sort of petroleum and by the modernity that accompanied it, how that was experienced by an unemployed worker in the north, and why it was that experience of that led him to join a so-called Muslim, quote-unquote, fundamentalist movement. That's not a term I like. I refer to it as a Muslim reformist movement. But why? Why is this petro boom, experienced by some who happen to be Muslims, produce in them an incredible sense of anti-Westernism, perhaps anti-modernity, and certainly a sense that the state is corrupt, is disgraceful, is amoral, and would be prepared to follow a very charismatic local Muslim leader who's saying, follow me, let's renew, let's rebuild our community, as an antithesis to all of that. Well, that's in a sense what Sarawiwa and the Agoni were doing. Not anti-Western, anti-modern, incidentally. They were saying, we want more modernity. We don't have roads. We don't have schools and pharmacies. We want that stuff. And we want it through oil. We haven't seen the benefits of that. So it was the experience of exclusion that, for me then, to go back to Thompson, helped to explain why this movement had such power, why Sarawiwa had such authority, and why there was such rage about this process of exclusion. So you're right, it's about the experience of exclusion.
And you go on to characterize development as dialogue and negotiation. But we should always remember that development's primary reality remains struggle, strife, and conflict. So at this nexus of the global and the local, what is intriguing is this emergence of a possible rejuvenation or a birth for the first time of a democracy as people try to articulate the issues that are before them because of the situation these global forces are creating for them.
That's right. I mean, I suppose that just again to take the case of Nigeria, but it would surely be as true as in India or Senegal, these sorts of movements that we've been describing, these sorts of experiences, involve, for me, a type of, well, to use the words of an African political scientist, Mahmoud Mamdani, he refers to the process by which a subject becomes a citizen. Someone who may be part of a polity that might be nominally democratic, but in fact is really a subject with no citizenship rights. That transformation is, for me, what's at stake in this type of engagement with globalization. These sorts of movements, even those, I say even because typically those Muslim reformist movements are often seen as recidivist or backward-looking or fundamentalist or antithetical to the notion of a certain sense of Enlightenment rights. I see those movements as exactly about the process of struggling with and creating a type of modernity appropriate to those conditions. I believe that that charismatic leader in the North, who I described in some of my work, a traditional cleric, was talking and trying to articulate, of course, in the idiom of Islam and in the idiom of his ethnicity and so on, a sense of rights and what they might look like. In exactly the same way that Ken Saro-Wiwa was doing this. So for me, they're about the creation of a type of modernity. And it may not be a modernity that necessarily is replicating our own Enlightenment history in the West, but I fundamentally believe that's what's at stake. Of course, I also recognize that it can take on expressions that aren't terribly pretty, to be perfectly honest with you, just like the creation of the nation state, you know, which we hold up as being a great invention of modernity, has always been an incredibly violent process, which of course nation states typically want to read out of their own history. Exactly the same way that the creation of modernity is, as I've said here, it's going to be about struggle. In the case of Africa or Asia, where it takes on the language of development, I just think that it's easy to read out of these bland development reports published by the World Bank or USAID the fact that that struggling conflict is sort of built into the process.
And one of the things that's really important, which actually was one of the points that you make as you consider the long-term implication of the 60s, is really local articulation, basically, of these problems. So it's as if these waves of globalization sweep a particular area, but the way that problem set is going to be defined really draws on local history, local culture, and local ways of doing it.
That's exactly right, and that's precisely the connection with Thompson that you gestured to before. This articulation for me is precisely about how ideas, practices, activities, global flows of various sorts, as Manuel Castells would call it, how these things are always experienced and understood and responded to and built upon in irreducibly local ways. That's the geographer in me. It takes that stuff very seriously, that there is a great weight to local history. There's a great weight to local culture. There's a great weight to local traditions. And those things may get refashioned and refigured. That's why the book that I wrote with Alan Pred was called Reworking Modernity. Reworking has that idea that it's not adopted. That's as true for something as banal as the fact that McDonald's shows up in India. Of course, it's not the same McDonald's, right? There's a clever corporate and cultural refiguring. It's the Maharaja burger. It's not the hamburger, right? So there's a cultural refiguring here, and that's as true for something as banal as McDonald's, which also incidentally, of course, generates resistance to it. It's been a huge cultural struggle in India over the very presence of them. But that's the articulation process that I'm talking about. It seems to me to be a fundamental geographical insight into the way in which these global forces shape our world.
In some recent lectures that you gave in Germany, you focus on the contributions of two major theorists and the relevance of their ideas for today. Specifically, you're talking about Marx and Malthus. And I talk a little about that the extent to which you are able, or a geographer or a social scientist is able to draw on theory and find different insights because of a current engagement with contemporary reality.
Well, I guess for me there's a larger, almost a pedagogic point here, Harry, which is that particularly in my own undergraduate teaching, more than anything else, whatever the content of it is, I'm always anxious to show that these ideas, the way that we think about rural development in Nigeria or overpopulation in China, has a history. And that those ideas in charting that history, you can begin to see how that they're products of their time, and how an idea like overpopulation often gets attached to different sets of ideas at different times. And in that sense, the importance being that, to use overpopulation, someone like Malthus, I mean, I frankly think that perhaps more than Adam Smith, more than Karl Marx, it's Malthus and the legacy of Malthus that is perhaps greater than any other of that sort of classical political economic thinkers. The very idea that we think about population in over or under terms, the fact that we can't, in some sense, invoke population and food and environment without, in some sense, recognizing that connection, is a testament to how incredibly influential such thinkers are. So when I say pedagogy, then I'm interested in looking at the genealogies of these ideas and how they show up in our own time. And that's as true as Marx. I mean, of course, the difference is that whereas Malthus, I suppose, has never gone out of fashion, Marx was never in fashion. And particularly since, 89 and thereafter, is probably even less in fashion. I happen to think that, the collapse of the Soviet socialist bloc was a stunning vindication of Marx's own theory, for what it's worth. But the point is that I think that Marx still has an enormous amount to offer, not least of which globalization. You can't read the Communist Manifesto and not be aware of the fact that he was acutely aware of these expansionary powers of capitalism, of its creative, destructive powers, of its global reach. And I think that was a tremendous insight that he had. So in looking at those two figures, I wasn't simply saying everything in Marx is worth reading seriously, and he had it right. Or Malthus had it wrong. But just simply saying that there are these genealogies that we need to be sensitive to, and begin to take from them and begin to understand how and in what ways they can speak to our particular reality.
And you're able to do that by actually engaging the local, the actual situation on the ground, and the responses that are emerging from a local articulation, so to speak.
That's exactly right. And I as it happens, I do think that was. You can see that in someone of the stature of Marx as a thinker. I think he was acutely aware, actually. This is, of course, unfashionable because Marx tends to get seen as sort of an apocalyptically sort of teleological thinker, that were the great gears of capitalism, sort of grinding along, obliterating everything in its wake, and the future of the world is sort of the future of Western capitalism. That's how he typically gets read as sort of a master thinker, the grand narratives, so to say, of Marx. I don't actually see it that way. I think he's acutely sensitive to what we were referring to before as this articulation of the local. And so in that sense, just to come back to Nigeria, one way of thinking about my work would just be to see my concern in Nigeria as a way in which this sort of incredibly dynamic property of capitalism, Marx had great admiration for it, this vitality, this energy, these forces that it unleashed. To see that, take that from Marx and to say, well, what particular inflection and structure does it get when it's capitalism that's developing around one particular commodity, oil, in a particular setting, Nigeria? How does that inflect Marx's view of capitalism? And how does it take on these local forms? Because we know that it's going to be destructive. This is a term that was taken from Schumpeter, not Marx, but Schumpeter was acutely aware of these destructive powers of capitalism. It's constantly changing and revolutionizing itself. We've just seen the collapse of the dot-com world here. That's exactly such a creative destruction in Schumpeter's terms. Well, the same thing happens under petroleum in Nigeria. And what I'm trying to say is, well, how is it experienced? What are the costs and consequences? What are the resistances to it? And that, for me, is what I would take out of Marx. I think he's acutely aware of that. But we'd need to obviously add a great deal to Marx in order to understand that and understand the complexities of it as it shows up in Venezuela or Iran or China.
Well, I would say that we've taken a few of the steps needed to put the pieces together from your intellectual oeuvre, the emphasis on the local, the emphasis on nature, the emphasis on the global, of an interest in resistance and the rejuvenation of democracy and so on. From all of this, what lessons should a student draw about how they might prepare for the future?
Well, you know, as I sort of began by saying that, you know, history does matter, you know, and I can think of no better way of preparing for the future than in part by looking backward, you know. This is terribly unfashionable, what I'm about to say, and recidivist, I'm sure, in some quarters, but one of the great teaching experiences I had on this campus, and I've been here for 20-odd years now, is I taught an undergraduate seminar, and these seminars that the university likes to promote for good reason, because they give freshmen an opportunity to work with a professor in a small group setting. And so it was probably 10 or 12 students, sort of the best and brightest, so to say. And I taught a class simply called Being Modern. Mm-hmm. And I had them read Marx and Adam Smith, and I had them read Baudelaire, and Nietzsche, and Freud, and Rosa Luxemburg, and so on. And in other words, lots of Western, dead, white males. And I did that partly as an experiment to see whether, frankly, giving Baudelaire, Paris Spleen, or Nietzsche, or Marx, you know, to a really smart 18-year-old from the Valley or from New York would mean anything. Would this just be an incredible snooze? And this isn't preparing anyone for some modern world. It's just some backward-looking recidivism, as I said. And quite the reverse. It was one of the most remarkable teaching experiences for me, precisely because, to a person, there was a sense that this spoke directly to their concerns. They were not mine. Their 18-year-old concerns were not mine, necessarily. But reading Baudelaire was something that had an immediacy for them. Reading Nietzsche had an immediacy. And so in that sense, this is not the only thing that one could do, but I do think being sensitive to the intellectual sort of legacies of enlightenment, whatever its downsides may be, and taking that seriously, not being caught up, I guess that's what I was saying earlier, with the sort of the cult of the new, the latest book, the latest journal article, but in fact coming to terms with these traces that are all deposited in us in some way is the most important thing that one could do in terms of thinking about what the future might hold.
Michael, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us to talk about your life and your intellectual journey.
Thank you, Harry. Great pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.